Hello, everyone. Welcome to this year's World Aquatic Animal Day on Disentangling the Sustainability Myth in Fishing and Aquaculture. This is a project of the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative and the Animal Law Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. My name is Peter Broberg. I'm a law student and legal intern with the Animal Law Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School. My pronouns are he, him. Thank you for joining this session, Room for Improvement, Insufficient Accountability in Our Legal Frameworks. First, we are really excited to have Diego Plaza, Center for Chilean Animal Law Studies, CEDA, Chile, with us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Diego. Before we dive in, just some quick kind of formalities, details to cover. This session is a Zoom webinar format, so you will not be able to see yourself or other attendees, only speakers. You will also be muted for the session, but you can submit your comments and questions, which I will explain in a moment. Please note it's being recorded, and we hope that it will be available to view in a few weeks. There will be links to the videos on the website, worldaquaticanimalday.org, and on the Center for Animal Law Studies YouTube channel. If you have any further questions about any of the events today, check out our website, which you can find by searching for World Aquatic Animal Day. So as for questions after the speaker's presentation, we hope to have time for a Q&A session. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A box located in the control panel on your screen. Mine's at the bottom. And if you want to share your attendance at this presentation on social media, please use our hashtag World Aquatic Animal Day. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Diego. Diego is a Chilean lawyer who holds a law degree from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso. He continued his studies in environmental and sustainable development at the Law School of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and later traveled to Portland to obtain his LLM in animal law from Lewis and Clark, class of 2020. Diego is the founder and executive director of the Center for Animal Law Studies, which is CEDA, Chile, and he is also the founder and president of the Fundación Justicia Interspecie, or Interspecies Justice Foundation in English. Besides, he serves as a CAL's ambassador for the 2021 to 2022 term. He is an associate member of the Animal and Biodiversity Think Tank program of Global Research Network and has collaborated as a consulting expert with the Animal Legal Defense Fund. All right, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, and I'll see you back for the Q&A. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. It's a great opportunity to talk about these interesting topics. So I will try to share my presentation, please. Peter, can you tell me, can you see my presentation?
Yes, you're good. It's perfect.
Great. So let's start. Today, we will be talking about some environmental issues in the exploitation of aquatic animals and fluvial water courses in Chile. This presentation may be interesting for the World Aquatic Animal Day of this year, since Chile is usually considered as a sort of a reference in the region in South America. So maybe by analyzing the issues we're currently facing in these areas, we will be able to make a sort of picture of what's actually happening there or here. So I will be talking about three important issues. The first one about the fisheries situation in Chile, the second one about aquaculture, and finally I will conclude my presentation talking about the production of hydropower. So let's start. Well, the dynamics known as the capture of the state by economic power groups or the corporate colonization of politics show us how the wealthy minorities of societies, also known as super rich, manipulate representatives of public authority to their convenience. And in Chile, an emblematic case, or maybe the perfect example of this situation, is what occurred with the actual fishing and aquaculture law, and the bribes made by different industrial groups to various politicians, as has happened, for example, with the Northern Fishing Corporation, Corpesca, the Association of Fishing Industrialists, ACIPES, and companies as Friosur. Basically, these organizations bribed several congressmen to extend to sending them emails on how to vote in the parliament or on how to answer interviews. And finally, the outcome of this huge fiasco was the creation of the actual Fishing and Aquaculture Law, also known as the Longueira Law. This after the name of the Minister of Economy at that time who promoted this rule, Mr. Paulo Longueira. A rule that imposed adverse changes for the economy, for the environment, and for animals. So basically, some of these sort of bad consequences of this new legislation were the following ones. For example, the Longueira Law established more restrictions for small fishermen than for the large industry, preventing smaller vessels from fishing in another region, unlike what happens with large fishing vessels. The Longueira Law also established that the large industry had to pay only for the licenses of their fishing fleet and not for the volume fish, which may seem unfair. Also, the Longueira Law forced artisanal fishermen to share their fishing grounds with industrial fishermen and did not include recommendations to extend the 5-mile exclusion zone for fishing vessels, reducing the catching area for small fishing vessels to just 1 mile, and giving the first 5 miles, which are extremely rich in animals and resources, to industrial fishing, devastating the country's marine ecosystems. And maybe one of the most outrageous adverse effect of this law was that the Longueira Law originally established that the fishing rights of large industries were granted in perpetuity and could even be inheritable. Okay, so the Longueira Law experimented several changes, and actually the current Longueira Law only grants fishing rights for 20 years, which still is many, many years. So yes, I was just saying that one of the main, not the main, but one really difficult problem that, or at this adverse change that imposed this Longueira Law was that basically it granted originally in perpetuity these fishing rights. And after some amendments, it only granted these fishing rights for 20 years. That's still a lot of time. And basically, the outcome of this system was that the distribution of the fishing quotas finally benefited 7 super rich families in Chile with the free exploitation of Chile's fishing resources. Families which have recently emerged in the past years into 3 large conglomerates, controlling 76% of the country's industrial fishing capacity and sharing profits calculated in at least $3 billion per year from the free extraction of Chile's marine resources. So in these images, you can see, for example, the sea of Chile before the Longueira Law in 2012. You can see the name here, Chilean Sea, and after that, after the Longueira Law, you can see the Angelini Seas, the Santa Cruz Seas, the Stengel Seas, and all of those seas named after the surnames of those families controlling the most of the fishing rights on those areas. So one of the statements made by the former Minister Paulo Longueira after the creation of this law was that the fishing sector has been boosted under sustainable development logics, safeguarding the future of marine species and positioning Chile as one of the countries with the highest conservation standards. However, these statements contrast actually with the state of the situation of the main Chilean fisheries, a report created by the Undersecretary of Fisheries of Chile, and official data, which shows that several species are overexploited and collapsed. So according to this official data, nowadays, the establishment of this system resulted in the intensification of the devastation of Chilean fisheries and the marine ecosystem. In fact, in this graphic, you can see my presentation, you will be able to note a gradual decrease in landings caused by the abrupt decrease in marine biomass and due to a prolongation of the critical state of overexploitation of many hydrobiological resources. which is all boosted up by the usual fishing methods used for industrial purposes, for example, such as bottom trawling. However, during the year 2020, a bill was introduced declaring the elongated law as undeniably null and void. This based on the idea that the constitutional principle of probity was violated in the parliamentary discussion process. Why? Because parliamentarians who had at that time economic interest in the fishing industry were involved in its elaboration without them noticing it, or even less disqualifying themselves from voting. This bulletin was approved by the Chamber of Deputies, and in September 2021, the Joint Commission of Constitution and Fisheries determined by 13 votes in favor to approve the proposal seeking the annulment of the law. We'll see what happened in the further parliamentary discussion process. We still have some hope that we will be able to change the system that have contributed to the destruction of the Chilean fisheries and marine ecosystems. So regarding aquaculture, the situation is not really better than the fishery situation, but we have to start saying that aquaculture was almost non-existent in Chile in the 1970s. It reached an extraordinary development during the 1990s due to a spectacular growth of salmon aquaculture, which is actually the main product of Chile in this industry. According to some sort of recent data, Chile ranks 11th in aquaculture production worldwide, and actually is the second largest salmon producer after Norway. So fish is the main exploited animal by this industry, and salmon is the most affected species. So at least on the paper, we have two different and sort of important regulated areas that may protect those interests, environmental interests and animal interests. We have an environmental regulation and an animal welfare regulation. So according to the Third Environmental Court of Valdivia, on a ruling on seafood SA, a salmon farming industry, against the executive director of the Environmental Evaluation Service, the court stated that the elongated law was completely oriented to a conservation and sustainable use of marine resources and ecosystems, even though it doesn't explicitly refer to that environmental orientation. We must infer, according to the Environmental Court of Valdivia, that the fish and aquaculture law has an environmental orientation, which is interesting. And on the other hand, we have this sort of famous Article 13F of the elongated law, which states that aquaculture shall provide for rules that protect animal welfare and procedures that avoid unnecessary suffering. Okay, this may look as a sort of avant-garde rule or article, but the truth is that it has many shortcomings. For example, first, it states that aquaculture shall provide for rules protecting animal welfare, and obviously the aquaculture company does not create rules. Who creates rules? The legislature, the state. Basically, it's a mandate for the state, and it's extremely difficult to make the state comply with this mandate of creating rules to protect animal welfare. But also, aquaculture should provide for procedures that avoid unnecessary suffering. Okay, those procedures are in charge of the aquaculture industry companies, but it's really difficult to determine what sort of suffering will be considered necessary or what sort of suffering will be considered as unnecessary. Sadly, it may be sort of easy for a judge to conclude that many kinds of suffering, of animal suffering, may be considered necessary, because if we analyze the elongated law on its first article, we will see that the fishing and aquaculture law is oriented to regulate the development of two industrial activities, basically the fishing activity and the aquaculture activity. And in that regard, many kinds of animal suffering may be considered necessary in order to fulfill that objective, which is the development of that industrial activity. However, this sort of legal poetry contrasts with what actually happens in reality. We have many problems in this area. For example, the carrying capacity of the water bodies, the fish biomass regarding animal welfare, the problematic use of antibiotics, the escape of salmon, among many others. We don't have enough time to talk very much about them all, but we will try to talk about some of them. For example, regarding the carrying capacity, we can say that in Chile, historically, very few assessments of carrying capacity at cage, farm, or fjord scales have been conducted. In this regard, there is an increasing need for a sound productive carrying capacity estimation tool in order to establish the maximum number or volume of fish that can be supported by a specific area or relevant water body without causing unacceptable changes to ecosystem. And moreover, regarding fish biomass, these very few assessments have been used neither by the government nor by the private sector to limit maximum fish biomass per area or water body. In this sense, I think that determining the acceptable fish biomass per area is not only important for addressing the carrying capacity of Patagonian aquatic ecosystems, but also for establishing a basic regulation to prevent overcrowding conditions inside cages in order to protect at least somehow some interest of these animal victims. Also, in Chile, we have an extremely problematic use of antibiotics in aquaculture, basically because in Chile there are no limits for the use of antibiotics in the control of fish diseases. And the only existing controls in this regard review the presence of antibiotic residues only in the final product. This is in marketable fish, but not in the aquatic environment intervened by this activity. And moreover, to comply with the actual regulations is enough for the aquaculture companies just to report the amount of antibiotic used to the public administrations. So putting this data into perspective, we can say that according to an Oceana report from 2018, Chilean salmon farmers are using up to 950 grams, so almost a kilogram of antibiotics to raise just 1 ton of fish. Meanwhile, Norway, the first world salmon producer, is using just 0.17 grams, not almost a kilogram, 0.17 grams per ton of salmon. So this disproportionate use of antibiotic on fish is not only a threat for fish, but also for human health. Because there's is many evidence that the use of high quantities of antibiotics has allowed, in fact, to the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in sediments. And also, there is some concern that salmon agriculture in Chile has the potential to increase the proportion of antimicrobial resistant bacteria to antibiotics that are currently being used in human medicine, which is extremely alarming. Well, the escape of salmon is really problematic in Chile. We have said that salmon is the main victim of the aquaculture industry in my country, and is considered as an invasive species, an exotic species, who compete in nature with endemic species when they run away from these crops. And according to some official data, around 1 million salmon escape annually from Chilean crops. However, in just one day, in July 5, 2018, 900,000 salmon escaped from a marine harvest crop in southern Chile. And we can mention many other problems. Sadly, we don't have enough time to talk about them all. For example, the Calius and the ISA virus, the eutrophication of coastal and marine environments due to the excessive amount of organic residues under the aquaculture crops, the harmful interactions between farms and wild animals, the pitch and pinch dilemma, among many others we still have to face and solve. Yes, I just want to finish my presentation talking a little bit about hydroelectric power in Chile. Basically, in Chile, hydropower is an important energy source for the country's operation, to extent that we have 3 electric systems, and hydroelectric power represents 27% of the national electric system and almost 40% of the ISEN system. And we should say that also for the production of this kind of energy, we have to necessarily intervene aquatic environments by creating, for example, dam power plants, run-of-river power plants, or even pumped storage plants. Today, we have more than 60 hydroelectric plants currently operating in Chile. So it's kind of an important source of energy. Even though many people said that this kind of energy is maybe green or clean, the truth is that it represents many threats for the environment and for animals. For example, the most significant deterioration occurs during the construction phase, not only because it occupies the site where the plant itself will be located, but also because it invades a much larger territory. This to the need to build temporary constructions for storing materials, placing vehicles, roads, closures, among many others. During this construction phase of the building, the air is polluted, especially with the gases from the vehicles that are used for the construction. There is a lot of noise, the vegetation is clear, and also the habitat of numerous species are destroyed, a task that may last for years in the larger dams. In dam power plants, the impact is even bigger, according to some studies, due to deterioration of the landscape and externalities that affect the population living in the flooding area. Similarly, ecosystems, archaeological sites, and heritage sites are affected, and even more, according to some recent reports, the rotting vegetation in the water on those dams indicates that dams are responsible for the emission of almost 1 billion tons of greenhouse gases every year, which represents about 1.3% of the world's annual human-generated emissions. I know that I only have a minute left. I just want to finish my presentation by giving a sort of message of hope by showing that sometimes environmental and animal activism, in fact, can change the destiny of human and non-human animals and the environment. And maybe the perfect example of this was what happened with the Hydropower project in Chile, which was stopped after a lengthy legal and media battle and tons of citizens' demonstrations along the whole country. So basically, this project was cancelled in 2017, and the project originally contemplated the construction and operation of 5 hydroelectric power plants, 2 on the Baker River and 3 on the Pascua River in southern Chile. And if built, this project would have flooded almost 6,000 hectares of natural reserves. It would have affected 6 national parks, 11 national reserves, 26 priority conservation sites, 16 wetlands, 32 private protected areas, and 6 Mapuche communities. So I just want to conclude by saying that even though sometimes we may feel that our efforts in order to fight for the environment and for animals, we may feel that they are not enough in order to achieve our objectives, or in order to achieve what we have in mind, we must trust in ourselves, in the work we are doing individually and with other people, because in fact we can change the history and we can make a better world for humans and non-human animals. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diego. That was amazing and so interesting. I'm now going to introduce our other speaker, who is Amy Von Saun. Amy is a senior attorney in the Center for Food Safety's Portland, Oregon office. After clerking for CFS in law school, Amy joined CFS as an attorney in 2015. As part of CFS's legal team, Amy practices environmental and, excuse me, my screen's lagged, environmental and administrative law to defend farmers, communities, and the environment from industrial animal factories, aquaculture, genetically engineered crops and animals, and the overuse of toxic pesticides, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Amy also works to protect the integrity of organic and ensure the transparent labeling of genetically engineered foods. A 2011 graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School, Amy has focused her legal education and career on public interest, environmental, and food law, earning a certificate in environmental and natural resources law. Prior to joining CFS, Amy served as a volunteer attorney with Earth Justice, working on animal factories on the East Coast and then litigating complex environmental insurance cases at a law firm in Manhattan. Amy is admitted to the bar in Oregon and New York. All right, thanks for being here. I will pass it to you, Amy.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Diego, so much for going first. Apologies to everyone that I completely misunderstood the times, thinking it was 10:30, and the allergies are killing me right now. There's a lot of tree pollen in our beautiful Portland area. So pardon me if I sound a little bit rough, but thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about all of our work in aquaculture today. And I'm glad that you got to see already a great description and some rough pictures of the harms of aquaculture to the environment and to other aquatic animals. But I will dive right in, or I will try to. There we go. All right. I think and perhaps some of this was covered, but basically, aquaculture, as we're talking about it here, we're not talking about indigenous types of managing fisheries that have been practiced in since time immemorial. We are talking about industrial farming in the same way as we talk about it on land. And aquaculture, in that sense, is the fastest growing animal industry in the world, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Asia leads in production, China being the largest country, and that it is approaching half of our world fish production. And for some species, farming has completely overtaken wild catch in certain areas. Shellfish, as in bivalves in the US, or at least in Washington State, is one example of that, and shrimp and other shellfish of that crustacean nature in the other. These are some of the fish that are fish and other aquatic species that are farmed. Atlantic salmon is the one that we're very familiar with. It's the highest value. Here in the US, we're the third largest consumer of fish, and we import about 84% of our seafood. So about half of that is being farmed. So we're a pretty big, creating a very big demand for this industry. And here in the US, I just need to make my screen smaller. There we go. Here in the US, aquaculture is over $1 billion industry. We're certainly not a leader, as you saw, of production. So there's a lot more expansion that could happen. Mainly, we're talking about inland aquatic farms, some net pens in state waters, and shellfish farming, as in bivalves. But of course, we're poised to expand. And the open ocean, that is federal waters, is a place where a lot of this expansion pressure is happening. So state waters go to 3 miles out from the coast. Federal waters, or the exclusive economic zone, goes from 3 miles to 200 miles. And so that's what we're talking about, is when we talk about offshore aquaculture or open ocean aquaculture. This is due in major part to federal grant dollars and an executive order signed by the last administration that took advantage of the supply chain impacts of the pandemic that we're still dealing with, to say we need to expand our domestic aquaculture industry, and required several agencies, and I'll kind of talk more about what laws they were acting under later, but required several agencies, NOAA Fisheries and the US Army Corps of Engineers, to issue permits and other documents to expand the industry into the open ocean. Currently, our aquaculture industry is only meeting 5 to 7% of our domestic demand. As I mentioned before, a lot of our shellfish and other fish products are imported. Farmed oysters, salmon, mussels and salmon are a big piece of that. As you can just see, this is just a graph showing how much the expansion of aquaculture has happened. And as Diego pointed out, before 1970, there really wasn't much of this. And it has expanded quite a bit, especially in the area of fin fish. And that's the kind of the biggest light blue bar there. So I wanted to go through some myths and some realities, that I'm going to move on to talk about where the regulation could be in our current laws in the US, and what are the major gaps. So one myth is that we need aquaculture to feed the world. The reality is that aquaculture harms wild species and commercially important fisheries that have already been feeding humanity for centuries. And now I certainly wouldn't say that there's not problems with wild catch fisheries. I'm sure other folks today have or will talk about that. But the unfortunate thing is that aquaculture can actually do further harm to those fisheries of wild fish. One of the reasons is because we require so much fish byproduct to feed these fish. If you're growing any finfish that eat other fish, and a lot of the aquacultured species do, especially salmon, this requires, contributes to overfishing of wild stocks. And those are specifically forage fish that are a really key important part of the food web because they're food for so many other species. Escaped fish can compete with wild fish and also spread disease, as was already discussed, and I'll go into a little more depth later. And then the pollutants coming off of these facilities. Aquaculture is usually growing luxury species. Salmon is a great example of that. This is again, like a top predator type fish, not something that's generally feeding the world, is really a much more expensive luxury item. Gooey duck that are farmed in Washington are also a good example of that. They're a luxury item in China and other Asian countries. And so they're quite lucrative to grow, but we're not talking about feeding the world. And I would just like to point out that, as I'm sure most of the folks here know, or everyone knows, world hunger is not because we don't produce enough food. It's because that food is not being produced or distributed in the places where it needs to be. The destruction of local and regional food sovereignty is a big, reason for world hunger. So not so much the lack of farmed fish. Another myth is that all aquaculture is created equal. We've actually seen an interesting split in the terminology that the Army Corps started to use the term mariculture, which is, marine version of aquaculture only, but also a term that growers of shellfish who are trying to do it, the right way, in a sustainable way, ethical way, are trying to use that term as their narrative versus aquaculture. And I think the fact that we've highlighted so many, that advocates and activists have highlighted the reasons why aquaculture is problematic, that the industry is trying to get away from that term. So just a note to beware when you see the nicer sounding term mariculture. The reality in terms of aquaculture is it depends on where and how and what species are being grown. Open ocean net pens or cages have the problems of escape, pollution, privatizing what were otherwise public ocean resources. And this is both in state and federal waters. And the carnivorous species that are frequently grown require more protein from oceans than is saved by farming. And so it's sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul. There are better ways to do it. Raising herbivorous fish on land in recirculating systems that, would have much lower impact. Now you still have to pay attention to how the fish are being kept. Obviously, the welfare of those fish is important. And then how is the water actually being drawn and recirculated and used? We've been very concerned with the new Aqua Bounty facility in Ohio to grow GE salmon. And I don't have that case on my slides, but I can talk about it if people have questions. We did win a case against the FDA approving the first genetically engineered fish, which is a GE Atlantic salmon, but did not actually get the court to shut down the company's plans. And so they're planning this big facility in Ohio that would draw a lot of water from an aquifer that's a sole source for drinking water, and then put a lot of that wastewater back into the surrounding waterways. So there's still a big environmental question there of recirculating land systems. So just a side note, but some of these systems can be designed with, multi-trophic integrated systems of, fish and kelp and bivalves to actually mimic the natural cycling that would happen in the ocean. And so, that's the kind of farming we're talking about, having diversity and trying to mimic nature. And the more that you mimic nature, the better that system is going to be for the environment and for the animals involved. Another myth is that aquaculture is good for humans. In reality, fish that are farmed have higher rates of harmful substances. I know we already heard a lot about antibiotics and the resistance to them. Pesticides, there's herbicides and insecticides that are used on shellfish in parts of Washington, fungicides on fish eggs that are outside the US, and then the treatments of things like sea lice and farmed salmon, because diseases are so rampant when fish are kept in close conditions like that. And then things like dyes to, say, change the color of farmed salmon flesh to the pink that consumers expect, but that they will not have. And farm fish have been shown to be less healthful than wild fish. The quality of the fats basically being less nutritious than wild salmon. So, this whole idea that eating fish is really healthy and we need to have more fish because it's healthy to eat, well, that is, somewhat debunked by the problems with farmed fish. So this is, I think, really the meat, so to speak, of the presentation, which is that aquaculture is adequately regulated in this country. And I'm only going to talk about the US here. The reality is there are no adequately protective or holistic laws to regulate aquaculture at a national level, because Congress has never passed any legislation. And I will talk about some attempts to do that. Federal agencies do have other powers under the existing statutes, but they have not exercised their authority as fully as they could to actually protect our ocean resources versus just to expand this industry. And of course, there are state regulations. Some are better than others. It is, of course, a patchwork, so it only it can regulate what's happening in state waters, but cannot touch what might happen in that vast amount of open ocean that is the exclusive economic zone. And for example, Cook in Washington, like Washington State, of course, has laws to protect their, marine waters, but Cook is an aquaculture company that has a lot of different sets of net pens throughout Puget Sound. And in 2016 or 2017, I think it was 2017, they had a massive breach of some of their net pens that were just in disrepair, and they released 250,000 Atlantic salmon into Puget Sound, where Atlantic salmon are not native. And it was this huge, big disaster. The company actually initially blamed it on the solar eclipse that happened that summer, saying that it caused tides that were higher than usual, and that was debunked. And it did actually lead the legislature in Washington to, through citizen pressure, finally say no more farming of non-native fish in Puget Sound. But as I will talk about later, there's still a problem with farming native fish in net pens. But so that's just an example of like state laws don't go far enough in a lot of cases. The reality is that there's a lot of harmful impacts happening to the environment and to wild aquatic animals, even with current state and federal regulation. And I just like this little infographic here to show just a good overview of what we're talking about, that the fish food is going in, the inputs are drugs and chemicals, those are coming out, so they're going into open water, as is the waste from the fish, escaped fish, their diseases, and then of course the attraction of predators and then harm to wild species that way. Some of the environmental impacts, and I do want to be cognizant of the time, so I'll go over these a little bit quickly, and I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who would like to see them. But the farm fish that are predators, of course, I said require a lot of fish. So you're having a negative protein ratio of you're taking more fish out of the oceans than you are creating an edible fish product. Forage fish like herring, menhaden, anchovies. This is disrupting the natural ecosystem balance. And aquaculture is predicted to outstrip the world's fish meal supply by 2050. So the idea that this is a really sustainable way to create our food products is not accurate. There's also this sort of switch over to say, well, we won't use wild fish, we'll use soy or other crops. Now, of course, there's a lot of problems with the farming of industrial cash crops like soy, which is largely genetically engineered and creates a lot of pesticides and a lot of fertilizers that get washed into the waterways. So impacts to aquatic animals from that. Again, the diseases and pesticides. So, just like any factory farm, any CAFO on land, when you densely pack animals together and they have higher stress, they're going to be more susceptible to disease and also spread that disease very easily. So the response, just like in factory farming on land, is to use animal drugs, antibiotics, other pharmaceuticals to kill the pathogens that would otherwise spread around. And while there's a problem with those pathogens in the excrement of land animals, the same thing is happening here in the water, and these animals are directly in the open water. So there's no containment of those pollutants. Some further impacts are escaped fish. Big problem with escapes. Another example in British Columbia that was before the Cook net pen and not quite as large, but still a huge problem. And, if there's genetic competition, if we're talking about fish that can, interbreed with native fish that are there, they can also pass on some diminished survival skills, because farm fish are just known to be generally less fit for survival in the wild context. And I saw that picture from the last presentation of the seal was pretty rough to see there. Seals and other mammals can get entangled in aquaculture nets, can actually be driven off. The physical locations of these facilities can disrupt the path of migrating animals. And then, of course, the ocean pollution. And I think we covered that pretty well. It's pretty obvious that if you put fish in the water, they're going to, all their waste is going to go right into that water. So again, an example is in Washington, where Washington State and the federal government, through the Army Corps of Engineers, and to some extent the EPA, are in charge of regulating this industry, but it's still harming shorelines in Washington. It covers almost a quarter of all, maybe more than a quarter of all the tidelands in Washington, to grow things like, it's a picture of our gooey duck, luxury products. And this is a kind of aerial photo of a bunch of oyster bags and then a bunch of gooey duck tubes. They're PVC tubes that are shoved into the sand at a rate of 42,000 per acre, and then covered with plastic netting. So there's a lot of plastics, some areas pesticides that are going into the water to do these sort of vast monocultures of species. This is showing just an example of all the netting. So this netting can entangle wildlife, and that's what I have some pictures here. Entangle wildlife, that's a juvenile bald eagle that's caught in the netting in that picture, crab and forage fish. And these are areas that are important for spawning for forage fish and for salmon, which of course are the food of the orcas that are critically endangered in the Puget Sound area. So what laws might apply? The Clean Water Act governs discharges to ocean water and also dredge and fill of wet areas. That's the Army Corps, so Section 404. And they've exercised that authority mainly over shellfish aquaculture, but EPA is the agency that would give you a permit if you wanted to discharge pollutants into the open ocean. The Endangered Species Act should obviously apply, because a lot of the marine species we are talking about are listed as threatened or endangered. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, if there's any federal action agencies, major federal action agencies have to examine the impact on the environment. FIFRA, which is our pesticide law, and would govern what pesticides might be used. That's mostly just to register those pesticides for the use, say, of aquatic animals, of farmed fish, and is not that great. We're working hard to try to make that statute better to protect the ultimate environmental impacts from those pesticides. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is what governs, and that's FDA. It governs animal drugs, and of course EPA is responsible under FIFRA for the pesticides. So we're talking about EPA, NOAA, FDA. A lot of different agencies here. The National Aquaculture Act of 1980 does not provide any kind of overall regulation or anything for aquaculture. It's mostly just support for developing the industry. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, which I'm sure folks on this day know much more about than I do, but obviously intended to protect the marine mammals that can be harmed by aquaculture. Same goes for the National Marine Sanctuary Act. A lot of the problems is, where do you site these facilities? Are they going to be near a place that is critical for marine mammals? Coastal Zone Management Act, giving the authority to try to, for states to figure out what is going on in their coastal areas, and various state laws. And I'm not going to get into that's just an example of California does have a law. California is usually the best in terms of environmental laws to protect their state. So some of the federal legislation that's been attempted, this is the kind of precursor to one of our cases that I will get into, that from this whole basically decade of the early 2000s to the teens, Department of Commerce, that includes NOAA Fisheries, was trying to pass this bill that would allow them to create a regulation, a permitting system for aquaculture in the federal waters. That's the open ocean or exclusive economic zone. These would be 10-year permits. There would be, supposed to be minimizing the effects on other resources, have some reporting requirements. They wouldn't allow GE fish to be grown, which is a good thing at least, but did allow for off-label drug use. So when you're talking about EPA or FDA approving a drug for a certain use, this would allow for operations to use them despite the label. And then, not worrying about impacts to fishing communities, including traditional fishing and indigenous fishing communities. And while they say look at cumulative impacts, they're not required to prevent them. So this would not be a great piece of legislation, but it never has passed. So while because there's never been any new federal authority from Congress, in 2009, the Gulf Fisheries Council and NOAA Fisheries created their own plan for aquaculture regulation in the Gulf of Mexico. So this was going to be, this plan took a lot of the same points from the federal legislation, created a scheme saying basically under the Magnuson-Stevens Conservation Act that regulates wild fisheries that NIMS was going to create, or NOAA Fisheries created this whole permitting scheme that would be a fisheries management plan, but just for aquaculture. So it really did not fit at all the normal fisheries management plan, which is to conserve wild species and say, okay, you're going to fish this wild, snapper, and this is how much you can take, and this is bycatch requirements, and all that is meant to minimize harm to the environment and to keep those fisheries sustainable. And basically, NOAA shoehorned in the idea of growing fish. And some of the pictures here to show, like, the idea in the Gulf of Mexico has long been to try to use oil platforms as a structure to put an open ocean nets or cages. And you can imagine the problems with that. The Gulf of Mexico already has a lot of pollution from, algal blooms from fertilizer coming down the Mississippi to all the shipping, oil spills, BP, and, is a place where there's a lot of traffic and activity already. And so some of the impacts that I'll show on the next slide at our site, but we sued NOAA Fisheries. We took them to court in Louisiana and said, basically, you can't shoehorn in this aquaculture. Congress has never given you the authority to open federal waters to industrial fish farming. There's going to be all these impacts, including to endangered species, that they just said, oh, there's no impact. They consulted with themselves and found no impact. But there, one species here is pictured as the loggerhead turtle. And there's the cute little baby turtles floating on the seaweed there. And because they float on these rafts of sargasso that through the ocean, that could very easily be entangled by these types of facilities. And of course, they also attract predators, all the things we talked about. So we actually won that case. We won at the lower court, and based not even on, we didn't even get into the environmental impacts part. It was just that the Magnuson-Stevens Act, when it says NOAA can regulate fishing, fishing does not mean farming. Wild fishing is very different than the farming of fish, and the statute was never meant to allow that. So we won on a textual interpretation and went up to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit affirmed. Kind of a great example of where more conservative judges that may not necessarily care about environmental protection are siding with you against an agency because the agency is trying to extend their authority past what Congress allowed in the statute. So that was a great win. And with that win, we did stop this permitting scheme from starting in the Gulf, and that was just going to be the first region. The idea was to do this in other areas of the country, and NOAA has moved on to trying to do or working on these aquaculture opportunity areas. This is under the Trump EO executive order that I mentioned, but for now we have stopped this scheme, and so that was a big victory. Another case that we won pretty recently was suing the Army Corps of Engineers over their shellfish aquaculture permit, and I showed you some photos of what that looks like in Washington. The appeal was denied, so we won on the appeal as well. And unfortunately, the Army Corps came back and issued another nationwide permit that is even worse than the one that we got struck down, and with even less environmental assessment. So that's funny at the end of the Trump administration. So we've taken them back to court, and we are currently litigating that case, Shellfish 2. And that's under Clean Water Act and the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act, should say. As I mentioned before, there's this Cook aquaculture net pen disaster that happened a few years ago. Well, after the legislature said no more Atlantic salmon, Cook said, okay, we're going to stock our pens with steelhead. Those are native, that'll be fine. Of course, there's even bigger impact sometimes with native fish, because if they escape, they obviously have wild relatives that they could breed with, compete with, and diseases are going to pass much more easily between the same species. Unfortunately, we got a loss at the lower court level. We did directly appeal to the Washington Supreme Court, and they also affirmed that loss. So basically saying that the Wildlife Agency didn't have to consider the actual impacts here, and that it was fine to just be like, well, this is the same as farming salmon, which is strange to me. And then this is an example of kind of this last case. We appealed an EPA permit, so we went up to the EPA's Board of Appeals, and that decision is pending. This is for a single facility off of Sarasota, Florida, and this is sort of since we won on the Gulf case, now there's no big permitting scheme, but companies that already do this kind of these pens in the Hawaii area, this one company is like, well, we want to show that this is possible, so we're going to do this, kind of experimental version of this offshore net pen, and get, the necessary permits from other agencies, and sort of just take advantage of this Wild West situation that we have with a lack of federal overarching legislation. And so hopefully we will be successful, but the standards that EPA has are not so great. I mean, it's just about the ocean discharge, and they haven't really written a whole lot of detail into that compared to discharge of pollutants into freshwater. So I know I'm probably over time. I'm going to try to wrap up right now. There's new laws that could fix this. The Keep Finfish Free Act is a moratorium on commercial permitting of marine finfish facilities, and until such time as we actually have good rules in place. And the reason again for that is like the Valia Epsilon facility, like we don't want this industry sort of taking advantage of the lack of any overarching laws here. And so we need to put a pause on that until we actually have a better federal regulation. The kind of opposite of that is the Aqua Act that would say, again, like much like those laws that had been tried by Department of Commerce over the years to say, yes, we are opening the offshore area for industrial finfish operations. So support the Keep Finfish Free Act. And then, so one of our duties as, watchdog organization is to try to keep up with all of these laws that are introduced and try to push the good ones from happening. Luckily, there are a lot of good other organizations that have, forming together and to do collaborative work to try to get a good law in place, or at least avoid the bad laws. And we do everything we can as attorneys at the Center for Food Safety to uphold our environmental laws that we do have and try to push that in the right direction on aquaculture. So some hope there, hopefully, for you. And that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening. And I imagine maybe if there's some questions, do we have time?
I think we are unfortunately out of time. Both of those were such great presentations. I just want to thank you both for doing them, for being here. Amy, whenever I hear you, I always leave so riled up, ready to write letters to the Army Corps of Engineers. And Diego, thank you as well. I unfortunately knew almost nothing about the state of aquaculture and farming of aquatic animals outside of kind of US water. So if there are questions, both Diego and Amy have said that you can email them and they will get back to you. Again, thank you for being here. This was so great. And just as far as the day goes, we're going to have a brief break. We'll be back at 11 for our next panel, which is Pathways to a Sustainable and Desirable Future. As a reminder, we will conclude today with an in-person action hour on the Lewis and Clark campus for those of you in the Portland area, and I hope to see you there. Thank you again, and we'll see you later.